Funding for Inner Compass is provided by Calvin College.
The life that's unfolding,
the world that awaits,
gifts that are yours to explore,
and God's to use.
It's all happening here at Calvin.
Welcome to Inner Compass. I'm Shirley Hoogstra. Do you know that there's a quiet revolution going on in the fields of economics and psychology? And the revolution is about how people make decisions. The research reveals and questions some surprising tendencies we all have about the way we make decisions. And our guest today has found a simple way to pass on this knowledge to the average person so that we can all improve our decision making. Join us on Inner Compass.
From the campus of Calvin College, this is Inner Compass, exploring how people use faith and ethics to guide them through critical issues of today.
My guest today is Harry Singh of the Siedman Business College at Grand Valley State University, and he is one of the few authors who have tackled the new genre of academic fiction, having just completed a novel called Framed: Solve an Intriguing Mystery and Master How to Make Smart Choices. It's both a murder mystery and a supplemental text for classes about decision making. Welcome, Harry.
Thank you, Shirley.
How did you decide to tackle this particular project?
About 10 years ago, as I was teaching decision-making classes at the undergraduate and the graduate level, MBA students, I thought that this technical literature in psychology, management, and economic disciplines about decision-making is so vital to what we do every day. All the time we make decisions. Some of them are trivial decisions, but some of them are very consequential. And I thought one thing I should do, or try to do, is to try to bring this technical literature to the layman in terms of an interesting context. And then the question really became, how should I try to make it interesting so that I can embed these concepts about decision making into an ongoing story?
Yes, so that's what you really did. You took a murder mystery and said, could that be really the case study for the literature?
Exactly.
Oh, interesting.
And the murder mystery seemed to be the right way to go, since normally in a murder mystery, there are a lot of clues floating around.
Right.
There's a lot of external information. Some of it is relevant and some of it is not.
And who doesn't like to solve a murder mystery?
Right. And then so you draw the reader into the mystery, into the intrigue of the story, and that forces the reader to pay close attention to the concepts and try to apply the concepts in the context of the mystery.
Why did you pick the word framed for part of the title?
Framed is actually a very important concept in decision making. Framing is the way we try to develop the initial conceptualization of the issue, the kind of boundaries we draw around the issue, what kind of factors we consider, what kind of factors we leave out, and what kind of alternatives and other kinds of information we gather. So that is one meaning of framed. And the other meaning of framed was essentially the murder mystery context. Eventually somebody gets framed.
That's what people think, don't they?
Right.
You know, when I was practicing law, it was always the most important issue was, how did you frame the question?
Right.
Because the answer is going to come from the questions you are asking. If you get the wrong frame, if you frame the wrong question, you might be on a wild goose chase.
That's exactly right, Shirley. In fact, one of the decision-making insights which psychologists have found is that framing the issue and stepping back a little bit and looking at how you conceptualize the issue is probably the most important part of decision-making. Our normal impulse is to try to get it over with.
Get it over with, right.
To jump in, make a
Solve
decision, and go. But especially where we have the luxury of time, it's really important to step back and try to make sure that we're asking the right questions.
I think that's what I noticed about your book. It said, in using the sort of step-by-step method, that you cannot rush a good decision. That step back and be methodical about the way in which you're going to answer the question.
Right. And in terms of framing, here's a good example. In the 1980s, in the early 1980s, auto manufacturers in the US were competing against the Japanese.
Absolutely.
And they were trying to find how best to produce better cars. One question which the American auto manufacturers asked was, how long does it take in terms of redesigning the car for the plant to shut down so that we can make a new car? And they found that basically they had to produce a large amount of cars, hundreds and thousands of cars, before they changed the model because essentially when they change the model, the plant shuts down, and there's an opportunity cost in terms of all the cost of production lost.
Okay.
And because of that, because the shutdown time was so expensive, they seldom introduce new models.
Okay, so they were focusing on this question: how long is shutdown? What should have been the question?
The question which the Japanese asked was, how can we make the whole process more flexible so that the shutdown time can be reduced to a minimum? Ultimately, the shutdown
Different question,
time,
right? Different
Absolutely.
question.
And the surprising thing is that ultimately the shutdown time was whittled down to a few minutes, like 5 or 6 minutes. The whole assembly line became so flexible in terms of introducing a new model that they could kind of calibrate the assembly line in a few minutes to roll down a new version of the car.
Wow.
And later on, Americans adopted the same kind of strategy, and it became a big production process in terms of lean production.
Okay, and that's why we see, unfortunately, sometimes plants might need to lay off people or really change the way in which they're using that production line in order to be flexible.
Right.
So there are some costs to that question and that answer.
Absolutely. But the important thing is that the constraint which we think about, which is binding our decision, sometimes can be an opportunity, depending upon how we frame the issue.
Now let's talk about the second one. If you ask the right question, then what about, you talk about the anchors in a decision. Explain that for us.
Right. Let me just explain the context of that first. Psychology has found out that there are a lot of different kinds of biases we have.
Okay.
And these biases are hardwired in our brain as a shortcut by evolution, so that essentially we're trying to find the shortcut as quickly as we can. It's very hard to avoid these psychological biases, and usually they are useful, but sometimes they're very misleading.
Okay.
And an example of that is anchoring, in the sense that whenever we get some kind of number or some kind of threshold given to us, we use this threshold and we kind of conceptualize everything around the threshold, even though that number or that threshold might actually be meaningless. Right. So in studies, people have given people anchors and told them that this anchor is useless. It might be a random telephone number.
Well, give me an example of a threshold.
Well, a very common threshold is the retail suggested price.
Okay,
so
let's
when you
take
go for selling.
Okay, let's go for a car, and they say this car is going to cost $25,000.
Right. So the typical thing done in terms of selling is that you multiply the cost of the production by a number, but multiplied by 2,
okay,
and then give a 40% discount.
Okay.
So the retail suggested price is really arbitrary threshold, but we always
because they've just made it up with a formula somewhere.
Most of it is made up.
Okay.
And then they give you a discount on that retail price.
Right.
So if we always have this boasting going on, I got a 40% discount,
right,
and I got a 60% discount. Now the discount is really meaningless if the initial anchor, which is the retail suggested price, is arbitrary.
So it's so high, so it really doesn't make a difference whether you've got it at 40%.
Right. I mean, if the retail price was at a level which was very close to the cost of production,
right,
and then you got a deep discount, that would make a lot of sense.
Right.
But then the seller would be losing money, and he wouldn't want to do that anyway.
So there is a psychological mind game that goes along with this, isn't there?
Absolutely. I mean, psychology is a major part of decision making.
Now, when you take a look at other anchors or take a look at other framing, are you suggesting that we should keep our options more open, that we should not try to narrow it too quickly?
That's one of the issues in terms of framing, in the sense that we should keep our frame flexible,
okay,
and try to get as much information as we can, and also try to have some secondary screens. In other words, focus more on the immediate issues, but also gather information on the side, so that if new options come up and new opportunities come up, those are not ignored.
So running some parallel tracks. So you're gathering maybe some information. If you think about it almost like a highway.
Right.
You've got your main highway, but then you've got your the margins of that highway as a ability to gain some other information.
Right. And a good example would be my friend is a portfolio manager in Chicago.
Okay, a portfolio manager managing money.
Managing stocks.
Okay.
And basically he'll have 30 stocks in his screen, in the sense that he's actually evaluating these stocks from day to day, looking at which are good opportunities to buy.
Okay.
So that's his primary screen.
Right.
His primary frame. And then he has a secondary screen. So he has like another 40 or 50 stocks, which he's looking at, not that much in detail,
right,
but he's looking at whether they have good buying opportunities. And if they tend to be, then he'll bring them into his primary frame.
Okay.
So he's a primary frame where he's focusing the information much more. And then he has a secondary frame of information, which he's not ignoring, to look for better opportunities.
So when we make a decision, we're looking at the frame we've set up, we're looking at the anchors or the biases that we have. And then the third one that you talked about is that we have to really be careful not to jump to conclusions based on cause and effect.
Right. It's one of the most misunderstood events in the sense that we always, as part of the simplification process, we always view things as cause and effect. In fact, that's what Immanuel Kant said, that we almost view everything with cause and effect kind of relationship. What caused what? But the important thing in decision making is that cause and effect is really very hard to determine.
I mean, it's not always as simple as it may seem on the surface.
Right, because most of the time there's an association going on between two things. But the extent to which one thing causes the other thing is very difficult to pin down.
Well, how do you know? Well, how do you know when a cause and effect is real or false?
Well, you have to. It's a statistical question, and essentially you have to rule out other possibilities.
All
because
right.
normally what's happening is that if two things are correlated or if they're associated, there might be a third factor which is driving the two factors.
Give us an example.
Well, normally we talk about crime and crime being very prevalent in low-income neighborhoods.
Right.
But the factor which might be driving it is education. The fact that
Is that the third variable that comes in?
Right. The fact that low-income neighborhoods tend to have high crime is mainly because the opportunity cost in terms of doing something else is not all that great. And really the best source of solving crime and making it less in the long run is giving workers and people the skills to have a productive life.
So again, when you think about the advice and formula that you're proposing in your book, it takes time and you need to suspend some of your maybe quickly held beliefs.
That's true, and you need to research the topic and try to get more information. If you have the luxury of time.
If you have the luxury of time. And that's what the premise of this book is if you have a big decision that you're going to really research for a family or for a business, for a school, for a corporation, to apply some of these principles. And then the fourth one is you talk about people have an innate risk level.
Right.
Some people are big risk takers, the people who do extreme sports, and then other people say, well, no, I really don't want to do that. I don't even want to get on an airplane. That's too risky for me.
Right.
So how do I calculate that into my decision-making process?
That's another insight from economics in the sense that everyone has an endogenous taste for risk. Risk is really a part of the personality. Some people are risk takers.
Can you change it?
Some people are risk averse. We do change it over time.
Okay.
As we get older, we tend to get more conservative and more risk averse. Younger persons are much more risk takers in terms of actually putting their life under threat.
Right.
In terms of driving more fast and stuff like that. Although they have the most to lose because if they were to die, unfortunately, they have a whole life before them.
Right.
So it's unfortunate that younger persons sometimes take more risks than necessary. But the idea from economics is that this risk taste, which is in your mind, based on your personality, on your age, on your other kinds of cultural factors, it's very difficult to change that internal risk clock which you have. And if you try to force people to take other kinds of safety measures, they end up taking risk in other ways.
Okay, so let me see if I understand this. So if I'm a high risk taker and you put restraints on me, I'm going to find a way to exercise that high risk clock, as you already described it. Or if I'm a low risk taker and you push me to take more risk, will I somehow subvert the decision so that I get back to my comfort level?
Right, because you want to get back to your own comfort level, and essentially you want to get back to your clock of taking risk. Let me provide an example. Normally, you would think that in terms of medicines having the safety caps, you would think that children are more protected because we have safety caps.
Right, that's what you'd think.
Well, actually it turns out that that's not the case because before safety caps came along, parents were much more careful about medicine bottles. They used to keep them up in cabinets and lock them up because they knew that there was no safety involved. Once safety caps came along, parents inadvertently got more careless.
Well, that's true. You feel like you can lay them around, actually. You feel like you don't have to put them in a special place at all.
Right. And then ultimately, kids are able to figure out how to open the bottle.
I see.
And then there are more accidents about kids ingesting different kinds of medicines. So essentially, whenever we have some kind of an external factor which makes us more safe, we tend to be careless in terms of taking risk in other ways. So it's sometimes very subtle.
How does that then factor into a decision making? Let's go back to our car manufacturer. How would a risk factor take be
Well,
applied there?
we have to be conscious about the kind of risk we are taking, consciously and subconsciously. Try to get aware of what kind of risk we are taking, and then understand the consequences of that risk.
Okay.
As long as we understand that, it's not bad to be a risk taker. I mean, after all, the whole world is founded by pioneers and other adventurers
right.
who took risk. It's not the idea is to be cognizant of the risk taking and make sure that we understand the consequences of that risk taking.
Does this apply to teams that are making decisions, that you have to have sort of an awareness of the, let's say, the cumulative risk taking willingness of your team?
Yeah, for team, it's actually more important in the sense that in a group dynamics, the kind of decision making can sometimes go into a crazy kind of spin, and the psychologists call it groupthink.
Groupthink, yes,
where
right.
essentially we tend to stereotype our competitors. We tend to adopt common fallacies which are self-feeding because we stifle criticism and other kinds of constructive ideas. So essentially, the whole idea develops that if you are not thinking about this the way we are thinking, then you're not really a team player.
Right,
that kind of
right.
thing.
Yes, that does stifle
And
that.
that is really bad, because at that time, especially in framing, in the initial part of decision making, you should be allowing different kinds of ideas to come forth, because you have to make sure that you have not missed out on some opportunity. So if you start adopting a kind of a attitude of groupthink, where you are kind of stereotyping your competitors and not really allowing new ideas to come forth, the group dynamics of decision making can get off on the wrong track.
Okay. Well, now the next one, we've got framing, anchors, cause and effect, risk. How about negotiation and trust? How does that fit in with our decision-making formula?
That's part of the group decision making too, but
Right.
it has to relate with other groups too.
So group to group. What is this group doing and what am I doing?
Right. And essentially in economics, there's a lot of literature about how different kinds of competitors compete with each other.
Well, that's
depending
business,
upon,
isn't it?
Depending upon the market structure, whether it's perfect competition or
Right.
whether it's monopolistic competition and things like that. But here the key idea is that trust becomes an important part of the relationship, because if there's no trust, then both the players might end up in the wrong box. They might both be damaged by the ultimate result. A good example would be, normally in an election campaign, you would like the persons who are running for the election to talk about issues which are surrounding the electorate.
We talk about a clean campaign,
Right, a
no
clean
negative
campaign, looking at different
advertising.
kinds of issues about how to create jobs and how to create different kinds
Solve
of opportunities, how to create educational opportunities and things like that. And normally what happens in an election campaign is that the person who is laggard, the person who is
Who's losing, actually.
losing in terms of the electoral polls,
Right,
he will try to get the upper hand by adopting a negative campaign.
right.
And now the person who's actually leading will actually have to respond somehow, because the secret is that the dirty campaign, where you throw different kinds of accusations at your opponent in
Is
campaign
effective?
ads, is effective eventually, because as, if a lie is repeated again and again on TV,
You start to
ultimately
believe it.
people start believing it. So essentially, this idea is a prisoner's dilemma, in the sense that when one person attacks the other person, then the other person has to respond. They both end up having a dirty campaign.
Right.
They both end up in the wrong side of the box, where everyone loses, just because there was no initial trust in terms of having a clean campaign.
So if you could, but it sounds like it's almost impossible, Harry, that this could actually really ever happen, that two opponents who have divergent goals will trust each other enough not to sort of cross the boundary. Because when the first one does, the second one has to respond.
That's right. I mean, there are only two ways to break the prisoner's dilemma. And one is to either have some kind of trust, which is very inherent, so that they don't kind of mistrust each other and try to break their trust. But the second issue is to have some kind of a binding contract,
Right.
which can be policed effectively.
Right.
Otherwise, the dynamics of the prisoner's dilemma is in such a way that you end up, taking the decision for your own interests, but ultimately the joint interest is compromised.
Now, does this apply to regulation and deregulation? Let's take the airlines, for instance. There used to be a time when airlines were very regulated,
Right.
and then they were deregulated so that people could set their prices, et cetera. And now we know that, if airlines charged the same price for every seat, we would have to pay a particular price.
Right.
But now it's deregulated, so all of a sudden one airline will drop a price and then the rest of them have to follow. Now, that's
right.
good for the consumer, though.
That's right. So that's why in terms of the Department of Commerce, our antitrust regulation says that this kind of price fixing should not be there among competitors.
Right.
But there could be some tacit price fixing in a sense that normally airlines tend to keep the prices high, but to get the summer travel market, they'll tend to have a sale going down.
Right.
And they're all watching each other, and then one airlines will announce a sale of summer fares, and then the other airlines have to follow. And in that case, the fact that they're following the competitor
Right.
because they mistrust each other is actually beneficial to consumers.
Although ultimately we do want good airlines. I mean, so the consumer
Absolutely,
must not want a price so low so that we don't have good options all in the long run.
Right, in
Right.
terms of safety and in terms
Right.
of precautions.
Now, what about deliberation as the next factor in decision making? What is this idea that you have to go through a lot of deliberate checklists to make sure that you're following the process?
Well,
Is it really essential? Sometimes you have to make a quick decision.
Yes, you do. And in those decisions where you don't have the luxury of time, it's almost instinctive.
Okay.
And you can't help that if you don't have the time. But if you do have the time, in most major decisions we make, who to marry, which house to buy,
Right.
which car to buy, what job to take.
Yes.
Most of the decisions we make, the monumental decisions, we do have the luxury of time.
We do.
And the idea is to try to develop a process, a deliberative process, and we call it a model, but it doesn't have to be a model essentially, where you go through 5 or 6 different steps so that your decision making is much more holistic and you look at all the factors and take them into consideration rather than focusing on one factor.
What I like about the book and the model that you've put forth here is it gives you a reason to slow down. It really convinces you that by taking these steps and by questioning, a bias, or do I have the right question on the table, or have I trusted in the surrounding evidence, that actually helps you make the best possible decision because
Right.
you've rechecked it.
Right. And there's something to be said about the harnessing power of a routine, because you harness the routine.
The harnessing power of a routine. What a great phrase.
Yeah, because the routine makes you have a soothing effect.
Right.
You say, well, these are the 6 steps I'm going to take.
Right.
And I'm going to go through the steps. I'm going to take a deep breath. I'm going to go through these steps, and then we'll see what comes out after these
Right,
steps.
right, right.
So essentially, you try to make the decision-making process less uncomfortable, more into a regular routine, and that kind of brings out the best in you in terms of decision making.
Now, the last step of your model is this feedback loop, and you say a lot of people hate to look back on a decision.
Right.
And yet, when you look back, you can actually learn what you did right or did wrong. But I think some of us are worried about the buyer's remorse. Look,
Right.
I don't want to have to beat myself up about a wrong decision. Why is that a bad concept to have?
Well, it's natural for us not to look at our mistakes because that kind of brings to us the point that we are fallible in some ways. But one of the major insights about decision making is that you really don't have to be a good decision maker.
You don't have to be a good
You
decision
don't have
maker?
to be a good decision maker as long as you're willing to learn from your
That's
mistakes.
right, because we all make mistakes.
We all
don't
make mistakes, and
Right.
mistakes are natural.
That's
There's an old saying, to err is human and to
Yes.
forgive is divine.
That's right.
We have to learn how to forgive ourselves in terms of our decision making. The thing which we should not forgive ourselves is if we do not learn from our mistakes. It's really
Right.
critical to look
Excellent.
back from an objective point of view and say, now, well, I messed up, and this is why I messed up. And the next time around, I'm
Right.
going to focus on this issue so that I don't mess up the same way.
There's a certain generosity of spirit towards yourself when
Right.
you say, look, I'm not going to be perfect.
Right.
And therefore, I will take an opportunity to look back and give grace to myself, actually, for maybe not making the wisest decision, but then I'll do it better next time.
Absolutely.
In some ways, when we have an idea of God in our life, we should be experiencing this model of forgiveness all the time because the God or a divine being we believe actually does, God does forgive us for our sins, and we should be able to forgive ourselves for mistakes.
Right.
So it's a very nice incorporation of some theological principles.
Right. There has to be some form of redemption in terms of what we do.
Right.
And it's important to look at that behavior we have and question it so that we can improve over the long run.
Did you see in the final chapter of your book, you talk about the heart of the matter?
Right.
That you need to really listen in decisions to some intuition as well. It's not just all rational, but there's an intuition piece.
Right. The way to look at decision making is that there are three ways to do it, actually. The first way is in terms of just an instinctive response, which is almost an animal instinct. You know, like in the book,
Right.
one of the characters gets mugged, and she has to decide whether to run or fight.
Right.
So this fight or flight response
It's
is
instinctive.
an instinct thing. Most of decision making is within the rational domain, where you use a decision making model and try to frame the issue creatively and try to come up with the best answers after gathering a lot of information. The third part, the part which is actually a bit more fuzzier, but actually very important, is this part about emotional intelligence and about how you can use your intuition, your
Intuition to bring to this decision making.
right, your internal resources. It's actually going beyond rationality in some ways, but you have to harness the intuitive powers of your mind to kind of come up with some solutions, which might be a hunch. You know, you've gathered all the information, you've used your rationality, and then you calm yourself emotionally and try to think inward in terms of deciding what is best for you, which is consistent with your inner nature.
Well, thank you for that wonderful summary. And your book is terrific. And I want to thank you for being my guest today.
Thank you, Shirley.
Dr. Hari Singh of Grand Valley State University Economics Department. He wrote the academic novel, Framed, Solve an Intriguing Mystery and Master How to Make Smart Choices. I'm Shirley Hoogstra, and thank you for watching Inner Compass.